Good morning traders, welcome to another RMD weekly market overview. Last week I've seen most of the markets recover, either pull back slightly or enter into consolidation, all but gold that is. That is actually good news, as this week we will have a look at many looming breakout opportunities along with the potential targets. I'm going to let the disclaimer roll and I will see you in the charts. As per usual, we start this week's lineup with the US dollar to South African rand. And just briefly looking at our price action from last week, we see that we had quite a couple of breakouts and pullbacks, with price reaching all three of our targets as set at 17 Rand 20, 17 Rand 50, and eventually 17 Rand 50. Also worth noting that we are still in an uptrend with the diagonal not yet broken at this stage. And then just looking at price action today and what can we expect for the week to come, note that today we celebrate the national holiday of Women's Day, although that was actually yesterday. So just remember to give a shout out to all the women in your life. We really appreciate and celebrate them. And any pullback at this stage will probably meet with support between the 17 Rand 50 and 17 Rand 43 levels. That is the diagonal and also one of the previous breakout areas, and of course our weekly pivot. So this would be an area of support, and should we see any bullish price action from this area or even from this diagonal, we can expect targets of between 17 Rand 87, that is the weekly R1, and then our larger major overhead diagonal meeting up with our monthly R2 pivot at 17 Rand 95, and just considering a little stretch target, we also have that diagonal going slightly higher to about 18 Rand. So that would be the lookout for the US dollar to South African rand this week. And moving on to the Euro USD. So despite the presence of bearish divergence and the dollar index finding some interim support, we unfortunately did not see the pullbacks we expected last week. And just briefly looking at the US dollar index, we'll see that it does appear that we have made some kind of temporary bottom. That appears to be a double bottom, with price bouncing off this weekly S1 pivot and currently finding some resistance at this overhead diagonal. So, well, it remains to be seen what's going to happen here and whether the dollar index will weaken further or find some bullish price action to take it higher. So that would remain to be seen. And perhaps just looking at our economic calendar for the US dollar, we can see that we have PPI figures on Tuesday at 250, and then we have CPI again on 250 on Wednesday, and then on Thursday there's unemployment claims at 250 as well, and then on Friday quite a couple of figures with the core retail sales also at 250. So 250 on all of these days, time to watch for some additional volatility. So that being said, we have now broken below interim diagonal support, as can be seen from this final 4-hour candle. And we are now right on or below the crucial support area, that being the neckline that we can see at 1.175. So price action between this level and the weekly pivot at 1.80 would definitely be the area to watch out for. Any bullish price action from this area will see us test resistance at 1.191. That is our yearly R2 pivot, as well as our weekly R1 and also our previous highs. So that would definitely be an area to keep an eye out for. Looking at possible stretch targets, should we manage to break this high, we can perhaps see price retest this area of ultimately retest would be a first test of this weekly R2 level at 1.201. And just looking at support can be expected between the yearly R1 at 1.57. That is also very close to our weekly S2, and of course the area slightly higher where our monthly pivot is currently at 1.162. So should we see price pullback, this would be a strong area of support. Also worth just keeping an eye out at this 100 SMA on the 4-hour, as that will probably converge on the 1.168 level where our weekly S1 pivot level is at. So should price manage to break below this level, we can probably expect price moving into this area. Then very briefly, moving on to the GBPUSD. So a very much similar situation to the EURUSD, with price action between last week's pivot at 1.30 and this week's pivot at 1.307, the area to watch for any price action. Any bullish price action from this area will take us to the highs that we saw last week at 1.318, and should we manage to break above the highs, we will see firstly our weekly our pivot R1 resistance at 1.327 tested, and should that break, then of course I think we should see our monthly R1 pivot at 1.337 being tested. So that would be my upper target for this week. Just considering in the areas of support, note that we have our 50 SMA on the 4-hour also converging on this monthly pivot level. So should we reject this area, we can expect to move lower down towards our monthly pivot level at 1.286, and also our 4-hour 100 SMA also probably meeting up in this area. So just considering any pullbacks, that will probably be around this area, and also notice that it will be coinciding with our 0.618 or our 61.8 Fibonacci retracement areas from the high. Moving on to the Australian dollar USD. The Australian dollar USD hitting our bullish target set at 0.722 from last week's video. That is where it met up at the weekly R1 pivot level, and that is where it got rejected to close on Friday right on the weekly pivot level. That was also the same level for this week's weekly pivot. And just before we look what to expect, just take note that we have figures coming out on Tuesday, it's tomorrow, on 3:30, and then of course we have employment change and unemployment rates also at 3:30 on Thursday. So should we manage to stay above this weekly pivot level and see price action from this area, we can expect to see the weekly R1 pivot at 0.74 being retested. That is also the previous highs that we saw from last week. So a breakout above that could potentially take us as high as 0.732. That is also very close to this major diagonal that we see overhead. Just take note that this would be a strong area of resistance, as that is where our previous highs all got rejected. And then of course we also have this pivot level. Should we see bearish price action below our weekly pivot level, note that we have this 4-hour 100 SMA that will act as dynamic support. So we might perhaps see price break through this level and find its footing on this SMA. However, should we break below this, the monthly pivot level is meeting right on this weekly S1 support. So this would be a very strong area of support at 0.708. Looking now at an S&P 500. The S&P 500 reached our second bullish target that we set at 3,330. That is where it met up with the weekly R2 resistance, and finally meeting resistance then at the monthly R1 pivot at 3,355. Of course, trend is still very much bullish, meaning that if we should be able to break through this monthly R1 pivot at 3,355, we might see targets of 3,385, that is our weekly R1 pivot, and perhaps if it managed to break above that as well, we could see targets of 3,415 being reached, as that is our weekly R2 pivot. Should, however, we see a rejection of this monthly R1 pivot level, we have our monthly pivot at 3,325. Sorry, I meant our weekly pivot level at 3,325, and of course our weekly S1 pivot level at 3,295, and that is also where we will probably meet up with this 50 SMA on the 4-hour, and perhaps also worth taking into account is that we have this 100 SMA that has been acting as a previous dynamic area of support. That will also be a strong area of support if price were to move down into this area. And if for whatever reason we would see a spike lower, we can see and expect strong support to be in this area between 3,215 and our weekly S2 as a pivot at 3,250, and that is probably also the same area we will have our 200 SMA on the 4-hour find some additional confluence. So that would be a very strong area of support. And we are now looking at Brent crude oil. Brent crude oil finally hitting our bullish target at 45 and finally closing the gap that we had opened since the 9th of March. Price was then rejected at this $46 area, and that is where it met up with this strong diagonal overhead resistance. This comes to show that patience can pay off. So for all the traders that patiently waited to trade that gap close, well done. Depending on the price action around this week's pivot at 44.58, we can expect that a break below this interim diagonal would take us lower. Well, firstly, probably towards this area of 43.95, where we have some support meeting up with our 50 and 100 SMAs on the 4-hour. And should that, of course, also break down, we have very strong confluence of support at a monthly pivot area at $43.15, and that is also meeting up with our weekly S1 pivot and also our 200 SMA, all converging in this area. And considering any bullish price action above our weekly pivot level, we can probably expect that we will see price firstly move back into this monthly R1 pivot area at $45.50. And should that manage to break, we will see price move back towards this $46 area. And that is the previous highs as well as this overhead diagonal resistance and our weekly R1 pivot. And should we, for those guys looking for a little bit of a stretch target, we of course have our monthly R2 pivot at $47. Looking now at gold, and at this stage nothing appears to be stopping this bullish gold run, with the classic yearly R3 pivot at 2050 having been one of the final lines in the sand from a technical perspective. And of course at this stage I believe it's simply best to trade with the price action. And that being said, the area between our weekly pivot at 2020 and our monthly R1 pivot at 2050, definitely the area to keep an eye out for. And as we can see, that's right where price are currently trading at. So if we do continue to see persistent bullish behavior and we manage to break out of this area above our 2050 pivot area, we can firstly expect this 2085 level at our weekly R1 to be tested. And of course, if that goes, we perhaps might even see price move as high as 2158. And usually I would have said that is very unlikely, but at this stage, and especially with the momentum behind this bullish run, anything is possible. Of course, should we do see a rejection from this level with price going lower, we have this diagonal support also very close to our 50 SMA on the 4-hour. So that is likely that we will meet up with this level at some stage. And if price manages to break below this level, areas of support would include last week's pivot level at 1,950. We also have our 4-hour 100 SMA probably meeting price at this area should price move into this level. And of course, should price move even lower, we have a very strong area of support at the monthly pivot level at 1,905 with some additional diagonal support and also our weekly S2 pivot level. As always, we conclude our weekly market overview with a view on Bitcoin. Bitcoin finally seeing some consolidation after a very bullish run. The trend remains up with near-term support in the area of 11,100. That is our weekly S1 pivot, and also the same area that we currently find our 4-hour 100 SMA. And of course, we also have our weekly pivot and 50 SMA finding some or creating some additional confluence right at the 11,500 area. And then just perhaps to get a better understanding or view of where Bitcoin might be heading in the week or perhaps in weeks to come, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the weekly time frame, as we'll probably need to be looking at some of the monthly and yearly pivots. So looking at the weekly time frame, we can see that the next stops could possibly include a resistance at the 12,200. That is our monthly R1 pivot. And then, of course, we have our yearly R1 pivot at 12,900. And just looking at this weekly chart, we can see that we have a strong support at the previous major levels of 11,000. And that would be this blue line that we see over here. So that would be our previous major level. And of course, we do have a breakout level slightly lower down at 10,250. That is that purple line that you see over there. And that is where we previously found strong overhead resistance, meaning that should price move as low or come back to test this area, that would be a strong area of support. And that is Bitcoin's view for the week and weeks to come. If you enjoyed this week's market overview, please remember to subscribe. And for those who prefer Facebook or Twitter, remember you can also follow us there. We have put links for you in the description below. Then just a reminder, we would love to hear from you, so why not leave your feedback or requests in the comment section below. Until next time, this is John Jacobs for RMDTRADER. Trade smart and trade successful.